Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Tonight it is already the 20th of September, and yet again I've been on a hiatus. This is going to become a regular occurrence because throughout the entire weekday I'm really busy with school, and so I have to catch up with everything on Thursday nights. And so all this information that I'm relaying now, probably if you were keeping track, it could be a couple of days old, but I do think it is still a good recap. And it's also a way for me to sort of just get accustomed to what's been going on recently. So then throughout the rest of the weekend, I could be just as well informed and actually go into more detail. So today is just going to be more of a general review of frontline changes, which honestly, I really don't like doing that and really being insular about it, but it is necessary at this point in time. And so we're going to begin by once again looking at Vuhledar and Vodiane as we always begin here. But of course, I always timestamp everything, so you could switch around based on which front you want to look at. So we're beginning here looking at updates that started between the 15th of September to the 19th. So you could see here in yellow, these are the Russian gains that occurred within that 4-day period. You have very small advances located east of Vuhledar, for instance, pushing south of the Yuzhno-Donbasskaya mine that was captured in early September. Looking northwards, this is where we have the more substantial Russian advances. You can see it's a piece of territory nearly amounting to 10 square kilometers. Significant advance. This is an open field region that the Ukrainians never had the means by which to fortify. So any sort of Ukrainian garrison from the 61st Brigade, for instance, is located in Katerinivka, and other ones may have sort of coalesced around Bohoyavlenka, and the more dispersed trench line located a bit to the east. But in regards to all the fields in between in those hinterlands, there's really no applied force by the Ukrainians to hold on to them. So the Russians, of course, take advantage of that, pushing through areas that are located in higher elevation than nearby Ukrainian villages, as you can see marked in this red rectangle. And a lot of the yellow that you see marked is really running along that same ridge. So it provides the Russians with this southern flank to put pressure onto Katerinivka and Antonivka, because here you have a cluster of Ukrainian villages that they have sort of withdrawn towards following the fall of Konstantinivka. And it's not just one village, it's sort of a connection, amalgamation of several villages that are really in close proximity and also have some trenches nearby. And so pushing from the south, that's a really huge vulnerability for the Ukrainians. They don't have a fortified southern flank. They're overlooked from that point. And then they're also, of course, diverting forces away from defending directly eastwards, where the Russians have not really made serious attempts at breaking through so far. So that's one aspect of this. The other aspect is the fact that you have Russian forces advancing already past Vodiane. This means that Vodiane is already in the process of becoming a Russian frontline node through which Russian vehicular assaults and infantry will bloom through and go towards other engagements even further westwards, most notably Bohoyavlenka. You could see how isolated it is from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison, and the perfect stepping stone to reach that area is definitely Vodiane. We have some videos to verify the Russian presence in this yellow area. This is an earlier video, but you have a video here that I'm going to click on. It's from September 15th. It's of the Russian side. They sent in a vehicle that, of course, it connected to an abandoned Russian tank that was also damaged, and it was able to withdraw it back towards the rear and get it repaired, in all likelihood. And so as it was withdrawing the tank, was coming under very intense Ukrainian artillery bombardment, again indicating that it's active around here. A bit to the west here, you have this video from September 18th. It's of a Russian vehicle that dismounted a squad of Russian soldiers. And again, this is happening just north of Vodiane along a really important diagonal tree line. The vehicle was on its own, was able to make it out in the open in broad daylight towards a tree line, dismounted an entire squad, and they just went in. The vehicle left, and that's how they're able to take over position here. The positions that we're talking about, again, not fortified. I don't even know if there were trenches there, but there definitely is foliage, so the Russians are going to make the best out of that situation. Now, looking a bit northwards at the region north of Konstantinivka, I discussed this in numerous other videos. The fact that you had this large open field region in between the Russian line of contact that you see here with the red color and the highway leading into Konstantinivka directly. That's an area the Ukrainians tried resisting in for a very long time. Elements of the 79th and 46th Air Mobile Brigades were involved in the defensive activities around here. They were very fruitful. But eventually, the Russians were able to chip away at the Ukrainian defensive holdings through incessant attacks from Pobieda, from Konstantinivka to the south, and also the frontal assaults with really large columns being utilized in some cases directly eastwards. Now, the result of that is that the Russians have taken over 4 square kilometers of territory and are beginning to make use of the entire span of said highway. You can see here marked on the map, September 17th, 3 FPV strikes conducted by the Ukrainians onto one Russian tank that was meandering along the highway. Now, if you zoom in, you could see that this Russian tank, it was rather close to this line of defense. This is a robust line of defense, very dense in terms of the concentration of trenches, and there also is manpower in this region. Manpower coming in from the 31st Mechanized Brigade, also have some territorial defense units and some drone support from the Shadow Drone Group. So there is a robust Ukrainian defensive component here, and they have 2 layers to their defense. First one, the Russians are really close to now, and of course they're going to utilize the highway to approach that region, but they can't use it to frontally assault. They have to take a detour to the sort of west and then begin overrunning it. And so that's going to be the next Russian priority in this region. And then you have one other fallback line that is a bit more wide, all with the intention of protecting this Ukrainian ridge, this really large open area south of Kurakhove, this ridge overlooking the chain of Ukrainian villages, including Antonivka, Ilinivka, all the way up to Uspenivska to the northwest. So that's the intention of the Ukrainian defense holding out in this region. And the Russian forces are aware of that. And I'm going to continue sounding the alarm about the gradual movement in this region, because although it's not the most important Russian priority at the moment, it's definitely something that could bloom in the future, that could lead to further Russian exploitations. So definitely keep an eye out for it. Now, when it comes to this region of Maximilianivka, as we zoom in, you'll see here a video from the 3rd Battalion of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. Here, September 15th, FPV strike on one specific house in Maximilianivka. Then there were also a few others. So my mapping of the situation is not as accurate as I would like. But again, I had to go through several hours worth of frontline changes and plotting in certain videos. And so not everything's going to be that refined. It will be probably by tomorrow. But what I do want to hone in on is the fact that the Russian forces have been able to advance through a very narrow corridor along Seltralna Avenue, as you would call it. Through Maximilianivka, Ukrainians are in control, if we're looking at the width, of about half of it, which spans 2.25 kilometers. The Russians, in the process of their advances recently, have been able to take over an additional nearly 1 kilometer. This is very important. The Russian push here is critical in the sense that following the fall of these houses here, there is an open road along the highway to reach the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove, including a lot of these fortresses, being within the range, of course, using small arms fire, mortars, whatever it may be, of the houses in Kurakhove, which are already at a disadvantage because they're facing the Vuhledar River. So that's already a concern. So definitely there is a huge Ukrainian emphasis now on holding on to Maximilianivka, just to prevent the Russians from, first of all, closing in on the entire Vuhledar River pocket to the north, but also to sort of truly try to avert any sort of direct pressure coming onto such an important Ukrainian frontline garrison. Now, as we zoom in and look further north at the Vuhledar River bridgehead, again, you can see here the Russians pushing southwards from Halizinivka. About a week and a half ago, that's when the Russians really took over the village and continued with their solidification process. So now it's been completed. Russians took over 4.25 square kilometers of territory, basically by advancing along the paved road vertically southwards, taking over the entirety of the village, Zhelane Parshe. Here's a video from September 16th before the Russians fully captured the village. It's from the 59th Brigade. I'm not sure which battalion, because really there's a lot of mix-up now due to the entire hectic nature of the Ukrainian withdrawal from the bridgehead. So it could be the 9th or 10th Battalion, I'm not sure. And so their tank element, at the very least, was able to enter into the southern entrance of Parshe, fire towards houses in which Russians were stationed. And of course, that inflicts damage, but it also gives us an indication of the Russian forward positions. So now it's also admitted by Deep State, for instance, but this village is under full Russian control. Now we're seeing the continued gradual Ukrainian withdrawal from the bridgehead, and definitely the fact that we haven't seen a immediate, complete attempt at pulling out. It's an indication that the situation for the forces leaving isn't necessarily I would say existential, in the sense that they're not in imminent threats of being encircled. There was, of course, a massive threat of that occurring, but it's not inevitable. And as long as it is not inevitable for the Ukrainians, they're taking the risk of being able to just drag out their feet in some of these fields and tree lines for as long as possible, just to continue buying time for all the other holdings located on the ridge west of the Vuhledar River along the western embankment, with a lot of these villages that you see here marked in X. So that's also continued into this week, and it could go on for a couple more days or weeks in the same process, depending on what occurs with Jelena Druhe. Because at that point, if you have the Russians advancing along the entirety of the perimeter of the river, reaching all of the supply points, that's when it becomes concerning, because then you're really tightening the lid, and any sort of escape route across the river becomes very much more limited than it already is. And just to remind you guys, even if there was a physical disconnection, the firing points that the Russians are using, they're getting very, very close to having complete coverage over wherever the Ukrainians are located in this bridgehead, or even the rear and the connection between the rear and the front. And so that also yields much higher casualties for the remaining Ukrainian resistors. Now here we have Ukrainsk. We're going to zoom in. There is a bit of a disagreement because according to Deep State, for instance, there is still a gray zone in Ukrainsk, which would be in this region over here, including the western portions and some southern areas, spanning some of the Ukrainsk slag heap and factory base. Some Russian sources already claim that the entirety of Ukrainsk is under their control. And we also have this footage here from the Russian 114th Motor Rifle Brigade DPR units. They've been involved in what I refer to as village hopping. They've spent the past month and a half going from village to village, all the way from Pokrovsk and Volcha, and have now made it all the way to Ukrainsk and are involved in the sort of forefront of the flag raising events. So they raise a flag over school number 12, for instance, in Ukrainsk, and also over a high vantage point right next to the mine, which you see marked an X over here. Indication that the Russians are at the very least in control of the most prominent portions of the city, and that what's left would be just remnants. And so taking that over is really important, because it also means that they have access to the slag heap. That slag heap is going to be very important on a local level for Russian forces as they look out westwards. And what they see next is this Ukrainian trench, which it's very likely at this point that it is not filled with manpower, because most of the Ukrainian forces have coalesced around Sukhurnia, and the Russians are like 2.3 kilometers away from that location. That's already an issue in and of itself. But in terms of the sort of the western, or I should say eastern approaches to that village, they're all completely dominated by the Russian presence now that will be felt by the fighters on the Ukrainsk mine. It's also overlooking this entire road, this paved road going diagonally to reach another slag heap, albeit a smaller one. And so that's another inevitable Russian target as you're looking westwards. If you look at the map over here, you can see the Russians took over a total of 3.4 square kilometers. It's an important advance, including in this northern spearhead, which is not related to Ukrainsk itself, but we're also expanding past it. So this is a 1 kilometer advance nearly, with the Russian forces really knocking on the doorstep of this warehouse region, some buildings, and also this sort of slag heap or smaller terracon. And so that's just also a natural barrier and a local height that the Russians will be interested in taking, with sort of severed connectivity between the rear. If we're talking about rear, then it doesn't really pass through Selidove, but it's nearby, and then makes its way all the way northwards to certain villages that are of importance, like Toretsk. If you look southwards, Andriivka is also over here. But in terms of looking at the northern flank, there is a possibility of cutting off some of the retreating Ukrainians, not entirely, but just reaching some of their key supply lines by advancing north and creating a wedge between Selidove and Sukhurnia. That's just one example of such a disconnection being possible. The more clear one would be Hirnik, because Hirnik, we have a Ukrainian garrison that has been involved in so much of a tumultuous journey, whether it be the new recruits that are being moved in that don't have previous experience, whether it be reconstituted units, whether it be units that were just rotated in or continuing to retreat. There's a lot of a variety in this garrison. And so far, there hasn't been a direct entrance into Hirnik because, again, entering into an urban-like settlement is going to be dangerous regardless of the context. So for now, we're just seeing the Russians push the mantle forward, creating a larger gray zone in between. And then you could see how their plan with Sukhurnia, for instance, will connect with the eventual objective of capturing Hirnik, which is definitely up there as one of Russia's main objectives in this region, as it plays a role with the Kurakhove operation and with the rest of the villages near the Vuhledar River. Now, looking northwards, as we zoom in, you can see here the Russians in control of this other mine, basically southwest of Krasny Yar. Again, for 2 weeks now, the Ukrainians have made their presence known in Krasny and Krut Yar. They sent in forward elements, likely from 93rd Brigade, to hold on to what I could refer to as a bridgehead, both because it's south of the main trench line that is gluing together the Ukrainian defense, but also there are a lot of ponds that are located north of where the Ukrainians are currently resisting. Now, this is very important because although it is costly, it is being able to buy time for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been able to buy essentially 2 weeks of time to build up their defenses, send in reinforcements to get sort of acclimated with the entire situation on the front line, with these trenches around Mykolaiivka spanning then southwestwards to Sukhny Yar. That's important. And so there hasn't really been a change in status. Now, the difference is the Russians are in control of the local mine. So it's going to be much more difficult for any sort of Ukrainian squad to, first of all, operate in these trenches in the first place. Because, again, most of them are in the open. Some of them may be under foliage or have coverings, but a lot of them are in the open. And that means that while you're fighting, you're exposed from your southern axis to just consistent Russian fire. That's just a huge risk that would have to be taken. Then, of course, looking into villages, and as you see squads sort of dismount from their positions in trenches and move into the villages, they would also be seen by the Russians, because these villages here, they're located on very low elevation near the Zherebets River Valley, and that has the same implications. Looking northwards at other advances, the most substantial one is around Hordivka. It's from the past 4 days, as I said before, amounting to 3.5 square kilometers plus, what is this? 3.5 square kilometers and a few hectares. And so as we look at the sort of magnitude of the advance in terms of distance, you could see that a lot of it includes an open field vacuum south of Hordivka. I didn't really have an idea of who controlled it. In all likelihood, it was a gray zone, but given the recent Russian advances very deep into Hordivka, it's just logical that anything behind it would no longer be a Ukrainian mainstay, you could say. So here you can see just some of the forward Russian positions, forward operating points before being pushed back or spotted by Ukrainians. And a lot of that reporting has come from the Ukrainian side. A lot of videos also being geolocated to help us get an idea of how far the Russians have pushed into Hordivka. Because if you recall, it's been a common trope that the Ukrainians have, in relative terms, stabilized the situation towards the city of Pokrovsk. Now, a big step of undermining that relative success would be to lose Hordivka in its entirety. Losing it in its entirety would really create a gaping hole. Because, first of all, north of Hordivka, you have this area that is not dense in defenses along the Toretsk River Valley. It's a perfect area for basically crossing over. That's one thing. Also, the fact that directly taking over Hordivka would put the Ukrainian garrison in this second line of perimeter defense of Pokrovsk in immense danger. So that's just another example. As we zoom in to get proof of the Russians operating this deep in Hordivka, I just want to show you the distances because it really is significant. It's amounting to 2.3 kilometers. Here you can see a video of a Russian squad entering into southern Hordivka. And again, this is very close to the Zherebets River, almost as if it doesn't have any geographic significance, just due to how narrow and potentially shallow it is. Now, here a bit to the north, this is already a video from 17th of Ukrainians shelling one particular house in northwestern Hordivka. This is actually past the river, so it implied that at the very least Russian forward operatives have been able to cross the river and make their presence known west of it, because there has always been the hope for the Ukrainians that even if they lose the rest of the populated region, like you see here in yellow, where they lost all these residential plots, that they could at least resist west of the river. But that's already beginning to get undermined. The next logical area to fall back would be to the trenches, but again, that is in very close proximity to where the Russians are already advancing, and they are already finding the weak points with a lot of these defensive organizational structures. Now, just to briefly look at Arkhangelsk, an area that we haven't talked about since spring with the Ocheretine operation by the Russians. But here you see a video. It's just a very small advance by the 1438th Motor Rifle Regiment, I believe. And so that's a unit that I recall from the Avdiivka days. Basically, a year ago, I added them to the map, and they were one of those territorial units, still are. and they played a big role in fighting in southern Avdiivka. And since then, they haven't had a very clear-cut role, but it appears that after a while of rotation and just building up the units, the most perfect area for them to be sent isn't to the Lion's Den, the most dangerous spot, but to some like secondary fronts that could also be in need of some small advances, but not anything too significant. Here you can see a manifestation of that with the regiment conducting this grenade drone dropping operation. And so they were able to drop the grenades onto the positions of the Ukrainian defenders north of the village, and then they stormed the positions themselves. Again, this is just one small step, but it is important because this front line here has been very stable. The Ukrainians have been able to stabilize using their vast array of defenses towards Kalinove. And again, there hasn't been that much of an emphasis by the Russians recently, but one of the best ways to dislodge this would be through advancing to the west over here through this ridge and overlooking the Ukrainian positions that are being built in yellow around Kalinove and extending eastwards. Now, as a result of some of this recent Russian uptick in pressure, an element of the 109th Territorial Defense Brigade has been moved to, further south to get involved with the defense. So they've been targeting Russian vehicles, for instance, near Kurakhove and Novokalinove. And also they have a presence, I believe, in between Toretsk and New York. So it is split at this point. Now looking at Toretsk, we have the continued development of the urban battle. You could see here in yellow, these are additional Russian advances amounting to nearly 1 square kilometer. Let's zoom in and see exactly what was taken. So you have, of course, some of these residential areas, the extension of the mine that was taken over really a month ago by now by the specific Russian soldiers involved, whether they be the veterans PMC or one of the DPR units like the 9th Motor Rifle Brigade. There's a few units that are just involved, very divided well, you could say, and abundant in terms of their manpower. And so as we zoom in here, you can see that the Russian forces were able to infiltrate into this rather small mine, but it is still a significant slag heap nonetheless, because this was one of the final elevated points for the Ukrainians to overlook the Russians as they begin to make it into the Zabalka district to the west, for instance, or into the center of Toretsk. Now that it's already compromised, it can't be used in that capacity. It could be fought over, but it's not going to be used to, spot and fire towards advancing Russian forces. And if they lose it, then the opposite happens. The Russians could begin to utilize it for their own cover as they advance through the forested regions, and also to overlook the Zabalka region and to at least be on parity with some of the high-rise apartment buildings in the center of Toretsk. So the Russians have unlocked a really important location that will help them out with the future exploitation of weak points in the Ukrainian line. You can see another Russian push basically occurring horizontally. It's been continuing now for months. You can see here just a small piece of territory taken over by the Russian side. Verified based off of a video from the Voron drone group, so 100th Mechanized Brigade, of FEB strikes towards specific Russian soldiers that were involved in that advance. Now, looking at the Chasiv Yar front, this is really something that doesn't come as a surprise to me because I spent, I believe, what would be years talking about this particular part of the front line. I wrote threads about it. I reminded it in videos. And also, when the 93rd Brigade was moved out of this region, I also, once again, ring the alarm bells about the potential for Russia to just completely exploit that and to create a large hole in the Ukrainian line that will have effects on Chasiv Yar, but also looking to the future on Konstantinivka to the west over here. That's the next area that really should be kept in your purview. Now, what I mean by this is that this sort of southern sector in between Klishivka and the Donbas Canal, it is a relatively open area. Of course, it is on a high elevation, but if there ever becomes a point, if there is ever a point reached where the Ukrainians are really, really exposed in this area and have to retreat to an area more connected to their combat operations, then they would have to abandon a large swath of territory. And now we're seeing the culmination of that because the 93rd Brigade, they moved out what could be around 4,000 men from this part of the front line to help stabilize Pokrovsk. And that's understandable, but moving them from this part of the front line without any sort of replenishment, it did leave a lot of manpower shortages for the Ukrainian defenders. So the units that picked up the slack include the Adar units, battalion, 5th Assault Brigade. There's a few other units involved, Territorial Defense Brigade from the 241st. You have here artillery unit involved. So there are a few examples of elements that were able to coalesce and were involved in the defense. Also, you have the 28th Mechanized Brigade. They're sort of split up between Chasiv Yar to the north, and also Zherebets to the south. So they are not fully committed to one area. And besides the manpower issues, you also have the fact that the Russians took over in the process, building up to this advance, large, highly elevated pieces of territory, most notably west of Klishivka, the fortress, but also every single field west of that at this point has also been on relatively high elevation, which does give the Russians an advantage when they're overlooking an area of lower elevation, or at the very least gives them parity, because in a lot of cases, the Ukrainians actually do have higher elevation if they're standing exactly on the canal or nearby on embankments, because those are actually slightly higher in elevation and do provide an advantage that will be nullified if the Russians have control of highly elevated fields to the east, of course. So in terms of the advance made by the Russians over the past couple of days, it amounts to nearly 9 square kilometers. Let's zoom in and see the video itself to confirm. So this is from September 16th. It's from the Akhmat Special Forces. So they posted this, and that's interesting because, of course, most of their detachments are operating in Kursk, but we all know that they have a permanent stay in the Bakhmut Chasiv Yar region, so they're still involved. They worked with the 4th Motor Rifle Brigade of the 3rd Combined Arms Army, so a relatively new unit created over the past 2 years. And they crossed over the Donbass Canal. They raised various flags on the former positions of the Idar Battalion, because the Idar Battalion reportedly was holding on to this region just west of the forest and the canal. And they were just unable to continue holding on to it due to the incessant Russian bombardment, destruction of mortar crews. So they were forced to leave their holdings before they were completely routed by the Russians. The Russians advanced 5.2 kilometers, so it is a large advance. And it's now created a bridgehead. Now there's an opportunity to expand it in the future. And based on the video, you can see that there are already these Russian soldiers operating in the forested regions in previous Ukrainian dugouts and raising their flags, acknowledging that this is only the beginning of the entire process of advancing through this particular region. And if you're looking at areas that could potentially also be impacted, you have various highly elevated mines. You have a few settlements to the west, like Stopochki, but it sort of leads into Chasiv Yar, but not in an entirely smooth manner. Now we're looking at the Luhansk front. A few really important changes as admitted by Deep State, but we don't really need them in a lot of these cases because there is some sort of other geolocated footage to back it up. Here you can see a Russian advance, a rather large one, 30 square kilometers, so it is significant. In a lot of cases, this is not something happening overnight. This is just a drawn-out process that isn't fully acknowledged by either side, either because of some sort of mutual understanding of not reporting on it from various Russian or Ukrainian channels, or just it's not as important, so they're not covering it. But you can see that the Russians actually have been able to solidify control over a large portion of the gray zone. This includes this like Nevelska Gully, very low elevated region with this ravine running along it all the way into the southern parts of Nevske and northern part of Novosadove. So that's just the perfect route for an attack. And it's an area that the Russians are in control of, at least partially. Then further south, just continued control over villages, buffer zone, to push all the way to the Zherebets River, because that's always been the intention. It's been very clear based on Russia's actions that they want to expel the entirety of the Ukrainian garrison from this region. And most notably, it's around Makivka, but even southwards now we're beginning to see preparations for the expulsion of Ukrainian forces from Nevska. You can see on the map that it's a Russian advance amounting to 6 kilometers. So yeah, it is big in its course. Let's see if there's some other videos from here to just give you an idea of the current situation. So you have the video from an unmanned system battalion of the 67th Motorized Brigade, or mechanized, and they conducted these really high payload FPV strikes, so had a large blast radius or explosive yield, and they just conducted strikes onto tree lines east of Nevelska. And again, that's preparation by the Ukrainian side as they see Russian squads pushing through here. Sometimes they're able to pick them off as a result. That's when they're most vulnerable, while they're on the move and oblivious to their surroundings. But as you see over here, the Russian push really to get the Ukrainians out of here isn't just happening from a horizontal standpoint. It's also coming from the north, from Makivka. Makivka is really being involved. There's another pincer involved that could help squeeze out the remaining Ukrainian holdings here. As you zoom in, and you can see Makivka, the Russians are in control of additional pieces of territory in the western side of the village. And so most of it is either under full Russian control or considered a gray zone at the moment. You also have, of course, renewed Russian position and positional advance south of Makivka with the hope of just relishing control over all of the open fields northeast of Nevske. Again, taking over key gullies, key tree lines leading into certain villages. Of course, key heights overlooking those same villages. And so there is an entire logic based behind it. Now, in this region, there's been, I believe now, two high profile movements of forces away. First of all, 12th National Guard Brigade Azov, they had many more responsibilities southwards in the Crimea forest, and so their loss isn't as impactful for the Ukrainian defenders, although, again, that's 2,000 additional men that are being moved out. Now, besides that, you have, so the 21st Mechanized Brigade really acts as a stopgap force. It is a NATO trained unit, has a lot of NATO grade equipment, and a lot of times when there's a need to sort of close a gap, then they're moved into assisting that. So that unit has also been moved, at the very least partially, away from this part of the front line to get involved with the Glushkovo offensive. Now to zoom in over here and just look at some other activity from today, you could see here in yellow just continued advances southwest of Novoselivsk with the intention of just clearing out the remaining Ukrainians in Salmakivka because they have been really holding out tooth and nail. So it is something rather difficult to do. So this advance opens up a pathway for the Russian soldiers to enter into Salmakivka from the north through ravines and then just begin to occupy the rest of the houses, which they've done not in its entirety, but you could see in red that they already have taken over a sizable chunk of the territory. And besides that, you already see how the Ukrainians are not making any preparations for withdrawals from these larger holdings, these open field regions just south of Pischane. And so this is an area that will immediately become exposed, even more so than now, even with the fall of Salmakivka, because then you'll have an emboldened Russian force, including large quantities of tanks that will be pushing from the east, along with the very potent bridgehead or sort of salient created by the Russian side just around Pischane that we're going to get to right now. So just to zoom up, you'll see what I'm referring to. You could see it in yellow over here. So in yellow, you can see additional Russian advances towards Kurakhove. That's just one example of a village. And then another one is Kolesnikivka. And so they are rather close to this point. They're sort of branching off based on tree line affiliation. So that's really important for the Russian side. And then afterwards, they send in their rear forces to just ensure that everything is under control. There can't be any potential local counterattacks because, again, we're talking about rather small quantities of men involved. But yeah, really the theme is that you have the Russian forces continuing to close the lid on the Ukrainians, whether it be from the 40th Artillery Brigade, which has been involved with this thermite spray of various tree lines, whether you're 130th Recon Brigade, 77th Airmobile Brigade. Really doesn't matter. All of them are in danger of not really imminent encirclement, but really being put in a position where they're in an enveloped area and are not favored in elevation. That would be, again, a very bad scenario for them. And also, you have the fact that the Russians are, if we're measuring it now based on this tip, about, let's see, about 3 kilometers away from the Vavcha, or I should say Oskil River itself. So that is, again, an important update. Looking at the Kursk offensive, we're going to begin by examining Kuranovo and then work our way westwards to the Glushkovo district, which is, again, really being eyed right now. As we zoom in, we know that on the 14th of September, Ukrainian sources were actually adamant that they had been successful in capturing Zherebets, Durovka, and I believe it was also Vitreno, and then by extension Olgovka. A lot of Ukrainian sources actually claim that they were able to capture these 4 villages, but that there are some Russian soldiers holding down Kremyannoy. That's something that I saw originating from Ukrainian channels, but nothing of such has actually been verified yet. There's actually not even proof that I've seen, and I've checked for it. Maybe it's just because I wasn't online for a week. but didn't see anything to indicate that there were attempts to uh, capture these villages that actually ended up being successful. So I'll have to wait and see. Now what we're seeing is a sustained Russian counterattack, and it's happened over the course of 4 to 5 days. You could see it marked over here to the north, an advance amounting to nearly 5 square kilometers and rather close to the highway. This highway that connects between, I believe it is Suja and Kurakhove to the northwest. So as you can see, based on this video marked here, it is just a Russian column that's pushing westwards, and they're pushing, I should say, eastwards, not westwards. They're pushing eastwards towards the highway, for instance. And then besides that, so the Russians already sent in some columns in this direction, making their presence known, beginning to get a gauge of the Ukrainian defense, and if there actually was some sort of faltering, then exploiting it, of course. Now this means that a lot of these forested regions located east of the main forested area of Krasnoyarsk, they're going to come back under Russian control, meaning that Russian DRG operators will become more active, that vehicles can pass through the forested regions without being spotted. So there are just a whole host of advantages to that becoming the case now. That's just one thing. Now, in terms of the larger picture of Russian advances here, this is something that is not unfolded over one day. In fact, it probably also unfolded while I was recording my videos, but I was too, I suppose, conservative in my marking of Russian advances to catch it on time. So here you can see nearly 86 square kilometers of territory being taken over by the Russian side. This includes Apanasovska, and that's probably happened earlier on, of course. But in terms of newer holdings, that would be Byakhovo, Vnezhepnoe, Gordivka. And as you zoom in, these villages, they're all connected along the same vertical road. And so capturing one is akin to then advancing and capturing all the other ones. So here's a video. It's from a Russian news report. I believe it's 7 minutes long, and it's just a confirmation of their presence in the school area. Or sorry, I meant to say that's actual presence in the village, because by the time that you have a military journalist operating over there talking to the soldiers out in the open, then it's already probably been a couple of days at the very least since it was captured. And so the film was captured on the 15th of September, but probably did happen earlier in the week before. But there was no actual video at the time to back it up. Now there is, and the video showed the routes all across the road to Gordivka to prove that the Russians are actually located here. And it showed some footage of FPV strikes onto Ukrainian vehicles that were organizing counterattacks, probably from the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, and also Russian columns advancing and taking over the Byakhovo region. Now, an area that is currently disputed, at least in my mind, based on the reporting and videos I've seen, is Obuchovka, because you had the initial attempts by the Russians to break through into Lyubimovka, and that was about a week ago, if I recall. So that was a significant advance that occurred through a largely open area from Snagost. And Snagost, of course, is a really strong organizational point, regardless of its current control from the Russian or Ukrainian side. I just want to see here if there's a video to show you guys. But regardless of that, this is from September 14th. This is of that really significant Russian assault, which we discussed in earlier videos. But in terms of a more recent event unfolding, and you can see that over here, it's of a Russian BMD-4. It was able to enter into Obuchovka, did so on its own under intense artillery fire, but eventually it's hit by two FPVs, and that causes the damage and causes the BMD-4 to withdraw, including some of the squad members. And so that is, again, proof the Russians are making in those forays. It could even be the case that Obuchovka is captured, but we have to wait and see. Now, the thing is, that directly leads into other villages because of the sort of tree lines and ravines connecting each village together. So that would include Pokrovsk, Tolstoy Log, and at that point, you're really reaching an area where it's very compromising to Ukraine's rear. It's very compromising. Also, if you go southeastward towards Dorino and Nikolaevka Dorino, every single axis of advance would have some sort of adverse effect in terms of the rear being able to hold on and glue together the entire Kursk offensive. So that's something that's worrying. And it's also why the Ukrainians, they are sort of going in for that wild card that we talked about in earlier videos by launching the attacks on Glushkovo directly from the south, and as a result, really putting pressure onto the Russian garrison located south of the Siem River. So in terms of units involved with a lot of these operations, we know that the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, they're the unit that's involved with the operations in Glushkovo and around it. So that's important for them, and they're also involved in some of these pushes into the villages in the southern yellow polygon. Then you also have the 106th VDV Division and some of their elements that are operating here, like the 137th Airborne Regiment. So they were the units involved with the columns being organized and attacking towards areas like Snagost or even to the southeast. They were involved in holding on to Kurakhove in the first place, and that was just very critical. The fact that Kurakhove never fell, it was in large part due to firepower, due to the Ukrainians being overextended, the Russians being able to move in reinforcements in time, and that meant that basically a block was placed over here that the Ukrainians cannot overcome. As a result, they were able to continue, the Russians, the steady flow of communication and supplies across the forested region all the way into the Loshkovo district. That was one route. It was very dangerous at one point, but now the Russians are in control over its entirety. That's one thing. You also have the pontoon bridges, 3 pontoon bridges being built. That, of course, allows for connection. And so the Russian forces were not cut off at the time, and there was a hope that the Ukrainians, from their side, that they would be able to just completely disconnect the holding south of the river from the rest of the Kursk region, but this did not end up unfolding. And essentially, what happened was you had 2 weeks of really a situation looking as if there could have been a pocket developed, and that's when the Ukrainians sort of doubled down, moved in the 101st Battalion of the 36th Naval Infantry Brigade. That's just one example that of a unit that put pressure onto the really the Russian side in this case. But yeah, now in the process, you have the 155th sort of building up, organizing its equipment, defenses, and setting up positions near the Dragon's Teeth and anti-tank ditches. So as you can zoom in, you can see the advances made by the Ukrainians into Medvedje, advance of 6 square kilometers. So it is taking over a small hamlet near the border. That's just a part of it, but it's a part of a larger scheme based on the location of the actual advances, the 2 of them, all the way to Glushkovo. Now the other one over here originated from Novi Put, and we're aware of that. And now it's actually extended even further to the northeast based on a video of a reported Ukrainian attack east of Veseloy. And this was not discussed, I believe, up until today. So we're going to receive more information from Russian sources as it comes in. They didn't really give us an exact status of the column of the Ukrainian vehicles that was pushing east of Veseloy. But essentially it means by which to just bypass the constrictions made by the settlement over here, because trying to push through is very difficult. It is a narrow corridor, so it's difficult for offensive activities. And you have the fact that the Russians, their naval infantry was here. They really dug in. You could see here as a result that the specifically the Ukrainian side had to sort of spot and target these Russian holdings that are meant to reinforce the frontline village. So you have the Omega unit. It's this drone detachment of the National Guard. They destroyed Russian BMD-2. Then here you have another example. It's of some other vehicle or truck that was hit by an Omega FPV, and it just detonated because it had ammunition stored in it. So those are just some examples of how the Russians are essentially still operating over here, creating a bottleneck. And then the only other option is to sort of bypass from the east, potentially then to flank from the eastern side, or to advance really directly along the highway towards Glushkovo. That would be another possibility, something that definitely the Russians should be taking into account when developing their scenarios over here. In terms of the extent of the Ukrainian attack, it is rather large scale, and I'm going to do more research when I have the time for that. But to my understanding, you have elements of the Korn group, so that's 116th Mechanized Brigade. At the very least, their drone reconnaissance element is here. You have specifically the 225th Assault Battalion. That's an assault battalion with experience in urban-like combats and just conducting attacks and counterattacks. So that's just their specialization. So they're one of the 2 battalions that has been involved in the vanguard of the operation. Because at least in the beginning, it was admitted that 2 battalions worth of vehicles, which would be, of course, dozens of vehicles at least, and hundreds of men as well were involved in the operation. So one of them could have been this, of course. 225th previously had roles in Vuhledar, for instance, and other villages that you see are currently still contested. Olgovka is a good example. And so, yeah, they're involved. You also have here the National Guard Omega Krila drone group, the same drone group that I talked about before. So they're also involved with this operation. And then you have, I believe it is suspicion. I don't think it's been confirmed yet, but the 21st Mechanized Brigade, a new unit that was formed in January of 2023, and they undergo new training, a lot of it as specialized, westernized training. They receive a lot of these sort of so this, while being a relatively new unit, they receive a lot of Western training, as we said, equipment. So like CV90s, the SGRV 22s that I believe we're seeing engaged in some of them being damaged on the Glushkovo Rayon border, I guess you could say. So they've been heavily involved. Also, probably some engineering equipment is coming from them. And so that would just make complete sense. And then those vehicles would be attached into the, I suppose, tank or other armored fighting vehicle category company. So that would be the utility of the 21st Brigade. So it is an important unit that previously served in the Luhansk region, now being diverted away to what the Ukrainians consider to be a more important defensive operation, as you can see here on the map. And in the future, we'll also add in the map in yellow, or I should say pink, of the anti-tank ditch and just some more broad defenses that are a couple of kilometers away from the border, but it's also some kilometers away from the same river and Glushkovo. And so, yeah, thank you all for watching so much and sticking with me throughout this really long video, but I think it was worth it just to get us on course. And so that's all for today. Thank you and goodbye.